Now, where the hell did you get that patch? The words hit harder than any gunshot. One moment, Leira Nox was sliding another ammo crate into place under the desert sun. The next, Colonel Rufus Hale was standing over her, a single brass round in his hand, and a look in his eyes like he'd just seen a ghost. The crimson-red fabric inside her collar caught the light, its black insignia sharp and unmistakable. Around them, the noise of Fort Holloway died in an instant. 3 seconds ago, she was invisible. Now, every set of eyes on base was locked on her, and the colonel knew exactly what that patch meant. This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The desert sun over Fort Holloway didn't so much shine as it hammered. The light came down in sheets of white heat, bouncing off the baked earth and corrugated metal of the supply yard until the air itself shimmered. Even the wind, when it bothered to show up, carried dust like grit on sandpaper, scouring anything left exposed. Out here, in the far corner of the base where the ammo depot squatted low and heavy, no one came unless they had to. That suited Leira Nox just fine. She knelt beside an open crate, her gloved hands moving with steady, unhurried precision as she slotted brass-cased rounds into the thick foam dividers. 1 turn press, 1 turn press. It was work she could do blindfolded, the kind that kept her in the shadows while the rest of the base moved in its constant loud rhythm. Overhead, a transport chopper flared dust into the air as it set down on the far pad. Boots hit the ground, orders barked, the mechanical whine of the rotors fading into the background noise of Fort Holloway's afternoon. Leira didn't look up. From the shade of the depot awning, she had the perfect angle to see without being seen. Every so often, she caught the reflection of sunlight off binoculars from the observation tower, a habit of the security team to sweep the yard. Today, though, the sweeps lingered a second too long when they passed over her station. It wasn't new, not exactly. Ever since the briefing 3 days ago, one she hadn't been part of but had overheard through the thin depot wall, her presence seemed to register differently. She'd been in the corner, tightening a loose strap on a supply harness, when Colonel Rufus Hale's voice had carried through. Western Gap is the breach point. Intel says movement at 0300. That's your window. A pause, then a lower tone, one she couldn't make out. She'd filed it away without letting it show. And yet since then, certain officers' eyes tracked her in a way they hadn't before. From the far side of the yard, Sergeant Kent's voice cut through the heat. Nox! It wasn't a call, it was a summons. She glanced over her shoulder. Kent was all squared-off muscle under a sweat-darkened uniform, his patrol cap pulled low. He had 2 privates in tow, both carrying empty shell casings in mesh bags. Kent strode up like he owned the ground, planting himself just inside her space. "You're supposed to have the 7 162s crated by 1600, he said, tone sharp. "Command's bumping the timetable." "They'll be ready," Leira replied, voice even, eyes flicking briefly to the clock mounted under the depot roof. "Still an hour ahead of schedule." Kent's gaze drifted to the neat stacks beside her. "You work fast when you want to." It came out as an accusation, not a compliment. Then, with a pointed glance at her long-sleeved shirt despite the heat, "You hiding frostbite under there?" Leira didn't answer. She reached for another row of rounds. Kent's smirk held for another second before he turned to the privates. "Make sure these get logged, and watch her count. She's got quick hands." The remark wasn't about speed anymore. When they left, Leira caught movement in her peripheral vision. From the open gate that led to the main strip of Fort Holloway, a figure in pressed fatigues and mirrored sunglasses was making his way across the yard. Colonel Hale walked like the heat didn't touch him, every stride measured, boots hitting the ground in a rhythm that carried authority without hurry. Conversations along his path cut short, even the sound of a forklift backing up seemed to fade as he passed. He didn't come all the way to her station, just far enough to see. He stopped near the shade line, scanning the stacks of crates, then letting his gaze settle on her for a beat too long. Behind the sunglasses, she couldn't read his eyes, but she didn't need to. She'd seen that look before, once, years ago, in a place no one here would believe she'd been. A radio crackled at his hip. Hale lifted it, listened, gave a short reply and turned away. No words for her. Not yet. The rest of the shift passed in a rhythm of clinking brass and shifting shadows. When the sun dipped enough to cut the glare, Leira rolled her shoulders, set the lid on the last crate, and sealed it with the depot's stencil. She logged the serials into the battered clipboard. Paper, not digital. Paper didn't crash, and it couldn't be remotely accessed. She was sliding the clipboard back into its holder when another shadow fell across the table. Roke, one of the senior NCOs from Perimeter Detail, leaned in the doorway. Unlike Kent, his voice carried no edge. "Got a shipment of 40 mics coming in. We'll need your hands on it." Leira nodded once. "When?" "Now. They're inbound from the north gate." He stepped aside, letting her pass, but his eyes lingered a moment on the way she checked her gloves, the precise tug at each finger before stepping into the sun. The North Gate run took them past the motor pool, where mechanics worked in the shrinking patch of daylight. She felt more eyes there too, not hostile, not curious exactly, but measuring. By the time they reached the gate, the convoy was already rolling in, dust trailing behind the flatbeds. Leira and Roke moved to meet them, guiding the first truck toward the unloading bay. As the lift crew moved in, Roke stayed beside her. "You ever work with ordnance outside the wire?" he asked casually, watching the straps come off a pallet. "A few times." "Yeah? Where at?" Leira kept her gaze on the cargo. "Different places." Roke chuckled under his breath. "That's a non-answer if I ever heard one." The pallet touched down with a thud, shaking the ground slightly. The smell of oiled metal and canvas filled the air. She stepped forward, hands already reaching for the release clamps. If Roke noticed the economy of her movements, the way she shifted her weight to counter the crate's momentum, he didn't comment. But when they finished the unload and started back toward the depot, he said, "You know Kent's gunning for you, right?" Leira's reply was a non-committal hum. "Guy's got a long memory for people who make him look slow, and—" Roke hesitated, scanning the yard as if the wind might be listening. "He's been talking to Hale about you." The rest of the walk passed in silence. By the time she was back at her station, the light had gone gold, stretching long shadows across the yard. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, a dust devil twisted itself into nothing. Leira set her gloves on the table, flexed her fingers, and looked across the yard toward the command building. From here, Hale's office window was just a square of reflected sky, too far to see in, but she knew he'd seen her today, twice, and each time something had shifted. She didn't know yet if it was for better or worse. But she knew one thing: in a place like Fort Holloway, attention was a currency, and she'd just been handed more than she'd asked for. The sun over Fort Holloway burned like a white-hot coin pressed against the desert sky. The air shimmered above the dusty yard, and every surface seemed to radiate heat. The rhythmic clang of distant metalwork and the low drone of idling engines wove together into the constant hum of a base in motion. Leira Nox adjusted her grip on the crate of 7.62mm rounds she'd been carrying for the past 100 yards. Sweat darkened the collar of her plain tan work shirt, but her pace remained steady, unhurried. Around her, the personnel of Holloway moved with a particular kind of bustle, half military precision, half barely restrained boredom. It was a rhythm she recognized from every staging ground she'd ever been in, the wait before something serious. She reached the double doors of the armory, pausing briefly as the shadow inside swallowed her. The air was cooler here, touched with the metallic tang of gun oil and old dust. She could almost taste the scent of it on her tongue, one of those sensory imprints that never left a soldier, no matter how much time passed. Behind a reinforced counter stood Lieutenant Marla Kent. Her hair was tucked into a perfect regulation bun, and her pressed fatigue blouse looked as if it had been starched into submission. A sidearm rested on her hip, and a tablet in her hand flickered with the day's inventory list. Kent's eyes, sharp and cool, flicked up the moment she saw Leira. "Yes?" The single syllable was as flat as the horizon. "I need to inspect your lot of M995 AP rounds," Leira said evenly. She placed the crate she'd been carrying down at her feet. "I heard they came in from Yates Depot last night." Kent's brow arched just enough to register amusement, or perhaps condescension. "And who exactly sent you for that inspection?" Leira didn't fidget. "Nobody. I'm doing a standard condition check. Those rounds are temperamental if they've been stored wrong." The room seemed to grow stiller, the background chatter of soldiers outside blurring into white noise. Kent stepped forward, resting one hand deliberately on the counter. "This armory isn't self-serve, civilian. Requests for specialty munitions go through command. Command hasn't sent anyone." There was no hostility in Leira's expression, only a quiet certainty. "Then log it as a preventive measure. If they're clean, I'll be out of your way in 2 minutes." Kent's lips tightened, the faintest smile forming, not of agreement but dismissal. "We run things by procedure here. You're not on the list." She tapped her tablet once, then looked past Leira toward the open doors. "And you're blocking the line." Leira's gaze held hers for a moment longer, something unreadable flickering in her eyes before she stepped back. "Understood." She turned, picking up the crate again. The sunlight outside was blinding after the dim interior. She adjusted quickly, her boots crunching over the coarse gravel. That tiny exchange would have meant nothing to anyone else, a clerk following the rules. But to Leira, it was the first confirmation that something in Holloway's supply chain wasn't as straightforward as it should have been. Halfway back to the storage yard, she cut through the refueling area, a long rectangle of concrete where metal drums and fuel bladders sat in neat rows under mesh canopies. The smell of aviation fuel was sharp and chemical, curling through the hot air like invisible wire. It was instinct, not conscious thought, that slowed her steps. One of the fuel drums, olive green, its stenciled serial number faded from sand and time, was swaying slightly with the wind. That wouldn't have been strange, except for the fact that every drum on this base was supposed to be triple-chained and anchored to fixed posts. She moved closer, scanning the ground. The forward tie-down strap was slack, hanging loose against the side of the drum. The rear latch was half closed, its pin only resting against the hinge without being locked. A few more gusts, or a careless bump from a forklift, and the thing could tip. If it ruptured here with the heat radiating off the concrete, she didn't need to finish that thought. Setting the ammo crate down, Leira reached for the strap. The coarse nylon rasped against her palms as she hauled it taut, slotting the pin home until it clicked. She repeated the process for the second latch, testing it twice for good measure. The work took less than 30 seconds, but the knot in her gut only eased when she stepped back and saw the drum sitting solid, immovable. "Hey, watch yourself!" The shout came from a young private maneuvering a trolley of hydraulic fluid cans around the corner. He swerved slightly to avoid her, muttered something under his breath, and kept going. Leira didn't respond. She just picked up her crate and moved on. 15 minutes later, the alarm klaxon ripped through the air. It wasn't the long, warbling wail of a base under attack, just the short, urgent triple pulse of a localized hazard. She turned automatically toward the maintenance sheds. A thin plume of smoke was curling up into the sunlight. By the time she arrived, 2 soldiers were already wrestling a portable extinguisher toward the open bay doors. Inside, the acrid smell of burning rubber and scorched paint clung to the air. A fuel pump hose lay on the floor, charred at the edges. Someone must have sparked it, maybe a dropped tool, maybe careless wiring. What struck her was how small the fire was. It had burned itself out against the edge of the pump housing, leaving nothing but a blackened smear on the concrete. The real danger, what should have happened, was nowhere to be seen. No exploding drums, no fire racing along a chain of fuel lines. She knew why. That unsecured drum she'd tied down, it had been sitting less than 10 meters from this bay door. If it had toppled, the fuel vapors alone would have made this a base-wide evacuation. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught movement. Staff Sergeant Garrison Roque, standing near the shade of a tool rack, arms folded, watching her. His usual smirk was absent, replaced by something more measured. He didn't say anything, didn't nod, but he didn't look away either. Leira broke eye contact first, stepping back from the maintenance bay as the firefighters finished their sweep. The smoke thinned quickly, whipped away by the wind. All around, the rhythm of the bass slowly resumed, though a faint undercurrent of tension lingered in the air. By the time she returned to the ammo yard, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the gravel. She set the crate down where it belonged, brushing the dust from her palms. Her mind replayed the events in tight, quiet loops: the refusal in the armory, the loose latch on the drum, the smoke curling up from the maintenance shed. Pieces, she thought, just pieces, but every picture started somewhere, and somewhere in this base the picture was already taking shape. The desert evening was beginning to lean toward dusk, though at Fort Holloway dusk meant only a softer kind of brightness, pale gold instead of white heat. The wind had picked up, carrying fine grit that hissed against tent canvas and rattled the metal siding of the supply sheds. Leira was halfway across the yard, a pair of heavy ammo boxes hooked easily in her hands, when the low murmur of voices drifted from the big command tent ahead. She hadn't been invited there. Logistics crews didn't get called into the nerve center of an ongoing operation unless something had gone very wrong. But she hadn't planned to walk in. She had planned to pass close enough to let the sound carry. Inside, the tent's main table was a pool of lamplight surrounded by shadows. A map the size of a small bed was pinned flat, heavy metal clips holding down the corners. 2 figures leaned over it: Lieutenant Marla Kent, voice clipped with tension, and Staff Sergeant Garrison Roque, shoulders squared but restless. "Western Gap is our least defended sector," Kent was saying, her finger tracing a route along the map's western edge. "It's narrow, under-patrolled, and the enemy hasn't shown significant activity there in weeks. If we move a detachment through, we could bypass the outer fortifications and cut hours off our infiltration time." Roque shook his head, a small, sharp motion. "Or we're walking into a funnel. That gap has high ridges on both sides and zero hard cover. If they're waiting, they'll cut us to pieces before we make the halfway mark." "They're not waiting," Kent snapped back. "Intel shows no recent heat signatures along those ridges. The terrain's clear. Intel can be wrong." Roque leaned over, planting both hands on the table. His tone wasn't insubordinate, but it was a shade away from combative. "You've seen them change patterns before. They'll go quiet on a route just long enough to make you think it's safe." Kent's jaw tightened. "We can't plan for every ghost story, Sergeant. This mission's already on a clock." Leira didn't stop walking, but her pace slowed just enough that she could catch the nuances in their voices. Arguments like this weren't unusual between planners and field operators. Maps versus mud. But something in Kent's insistence struck her. It wasn't confidence in the plan, it was a kind of forcefulness that suggested she was pushing against her own doubt. She shifted her path to pass along the side of the tent where the flap was tied open. From there, she caught sight of the map itself. Her eyes skimmed the lines and markings in seconds, natural choke points, marked enemy emplacements, the red dashed line of the proposed Western Gap route. And then she saw something else. Barely visible in the lamplight, faint grey hatching marked an area just north of the gap. Lines so fine they could have been part of the map's topographic texture. To anyone without reason to look, they were nothing. To her, they were a tell. Old, decommissioned maps sometimes carried notations for structures that no longer existed, or were supposed to no longer exist. Underground bunkers. They'd been cut from active charts years ago after an official demolition, but demolition was rarely thorough in enemy-held regions. If even part of that network remained, it would be the perfect place to stage an ambush. She kept moving, boots silent over the hard-packed sand, until she was beyond the tent. The evening wind caught at the edges of her shirt, tugging like a warning. A sharp voice broke into the air behind her. "Nox!" She turned. Colonel Rufus Hale was striding across the yard from the far side of the tent, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform sleeves rolled to the forearms. His eyes, a pale steel blue, locked on her with the focus of someone who'd just made a decision mid-step. "Sir," she acknowledged, setting down the ammo boxes. He stopped in front of her, studying her for a long moment, not the surface details, but deeper, as if weighing her against some invisible measure. "Your logistics," he said. It wasn't a question. "Currently," she replied. "What were you doing near the command tent? Moving supplies?" She didn't blink. Hale's gaze flicked briefly to the ammo boxes, then back to her face. "You heard them." Again, not a question. Leira didn't deny it. "I heard enough to know the Western Gap isn't the shortcut they think it is." Roke had emerged from the tent behind him, brow furrowed. Kent followed, expression tight. The air between all of them seemed to thin. Hale's tone sharpened just slightly. "Explain." Leira shifted one box to the ground, freeing her right hand. She traced an invisible line in the air. "North of the gap, half a click, you'll find an old grid of subsurface bunkers. They were used for munitions storage during the early phase of the war. The official maps show them gone. The real terrain says otherwise." Kent stepped forward, irritation flashing in her voice. "Those bunkers were demolished 8 years ago. You can't possibly know they're still there." "They are," Leira interrupted, her voice even. "And if I were staging an ambush, I'd wait inside them. No heat signature until you're practically in range. By the time your scouts think something's wrong, you'll have 100 meters of kill zone at your back." Kent's mouth opened to retort, but Hale lifted a hand. He was watching Leira in a way that made the rest of the yard fade. "How do you know this?" For a long heartbeat, she didn't answer. Then she reached up with her free hand, hooked 2 fingers under the collar of her shirt, and pulled it aside just enough for the crimson-red fabric to catch the fading sunlight. The black insignia there, a stylized wing and blade, was small but unmistakable to anyone who knew what it meant. Echo red. The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the air. Roke's eyes widened slightly. Kent's narrowed. Somewhere down the yard, a loose sheet of metal rattled in the wind. Hale's gaze didn't leave her collar. "I see." His voice had lost none of its calm, but there was a new edge in it, a recognition. Leira let the collar fall back into place. "If you want your people to come back from this mission, Colonel, you'll reroute them." He studied her for another long moment, then gave the smallest nod. "We'll talk." Without another word, he turned toward the tent, gesturing for Roke to follow. Kent hesitated, eyes lingering on Leira with something caught between suspicion and reluctant curiosity, before she stepped after them. Leira bent, picked up the ammo boxes and walked toward the storage bay. The gold light of the desert evening washed over her, soft but relentless. She felt the shift, Not in the base's movements, not yet, but in the undercurrent. She'd been invisible 3 days ago. That was over now. The late afternoon sun pressed a molten glow over Fort Holloway, its light bouncing off metal containers and corrugated steel roofs until every surface seemed to shimmer. Heat radiated from the ground in ghostly ripples. In the munitions yard, the air smelled of oil, sand, and the faint tang of explosives, a scent most soldiers stopped noticing after the first week, but one that Leira never ignored. She was inventorying a row of sealed crates, her gloved hands moving methodically from latch to latch. A transport manifest fluttered in the breeze on the clipboard beside her. Each crate bore the stenciled codes she'd memorized, each weight and vibration familiar. It was a rhythm, almost meditative, until her fingertips paused on the next crate. This one was wrong. The weight was fine, the lock unbroken, but something beneath the surface felt off. A faint hum, not audible, felt. She crouched, pressing her palm against the metal. The sensation was subtle but steady, like the faint thrum of an electric current. Leira's eyes narrowed. She slid the crate toward her slightly, using her boots to brace against the packed dirt. Her gaze swept the yard. The nearest soldiers were busy loading the flatbed that would ferry munitions to the helipad. No one was watching her. She popped the latch. The hinges groaned softly, and the lid rose on its slow pneumatic hiss. Inside, rows of olive-drab packages sat snug in foam slots, standard C4 blocks. At first glance, nothing unusual, but at the corner of the second row, nestled like a snake in dry grass, was a small rectangular device with a digital face. The timer glowed in steady red numbers. 0:14:32. Leira's stomach didn't drop. Her pulse didn't spike. Instead, her mind clicked into a different gear. Cool, precise, efficient. Whoever had packed this had wired the timer to detonate not on impact, but on schedule. And the schedule was less than 15 minutes away. She reached for her radio, then stopped. A full alert would cause chaos, men rushing, shouting, perhaps jostling the crate. The wrong bump could turn the countdown into an instant detonation. Her voice was low but sharp. Roke. The staff sergeant's head popped up from the far side of the yard, where he'd been checking pallet straps. What? Here, now? There was an unmistakable urgency in her voice that pulled him into motion. Roke broke into a jog, his boots pounding steadily against the compacted earth beneath them. As he reached her side, she moved aside without hesitation, giving him an unobstructed view inside the open crate. The color drained slightly from his face as his eyes locked onto the contents. Jesus. Is that what I think it is? Leira's reply was calm but firm. C4 with an active timer, and it's been set incorrectly. If this gets loaded onto the helicopter... Roke finished the sentence grimly, his voice dropping low. It'll blow half the supply yard to hell. Around them, life at the base continued, as if unaware of the ticking time bomb mere feet away. A forklift reversed with a series of sharp beeps, while somewhere close by the sharp clang of a wrench striking the ground echoed faintly. Swearing under his breath, Roke's expression hardened. "We need the explosive ordnance disposal team here, now!" Leira's tone was flat and measured, but carried the weight of urgency. "They'll take at least 10 minutes to get here. And we've got only 14. He turned to look at her, disbelief flickering across his features. "You're not seriously suggesting..." Before he could finish, the gravity of the situation settled between them like a shadow. Time was slipping away, and a decision had to be made fast. But she was already kneeling, stripping her gloves. Her bare fingers were steadier than any tool for this kind of work. The device was small, no bigger than a deck of cards, but the wires feeding into it had been looped and tucked to make removal difficult. She traced each one visually, green, yellow, black, and a twisted red strand that seemed almost decorative until you saw where it disappeared into the block beside it. The setup wasn't textbook. It was personal. Someone had built this with their own pattern, perhaps to trip up anyone who thought they knew the rules. Roke crouched beside her, eyes darting between her hands and the yard. "You've done this before. Once or twice," she murmured. "Hold the lid." He pressed it open while she reached in with a small multi-tool from her pocket. The wind shifted, carrying voices from the direction of the helipad. The chopper was already spinning up, preparing for the load. Timer 0117. She worked in silence, isolating the red strand. It looped under the black wire in a way that made cutting it first tempting, but she saw the trick. If severed before the black was stabilized, the charge would short into detonation. Her fingertips moved like they were remembering a dance. Clamp here, twist there, a slow, deliberate pull to free the red from its false anchor. Roke's breath was a low hiss. "That's not standard." "No," she agreed. "It's smarter." The red came free and she anchored it with a strip of electrical tape she pulled from her kit. Then she cut the black cleanly, no hesitation. The timer stuttered, flickered, and went dead. Silence, save for the thrum of the chopper. She released a slow, steady breath and carefully placed the device into a compact, blast-resistant pouch she had retrieved from a hidden compartment along the crate's side. It was almost ironic. Each crate was equipped with these pouches, ostensibly for securing delicate or sensitive components, yet most soldiers repurposed them to stash their lunches or spare socks without a second thought. Roke eased the lid closed with a soft, controlled motion. His voice carried a mix of awe and disbelief as he muttered, "You just stopped us from walking into a fireworks display. None of us would have survived." Before Leira could respond or even acknowledge the weight of his words, a shadow darkened the scene. Colonel Hale appeared, standing tall with his arms crossed, his face set in an unreadable, stone-like expression. Behind him, two other officers lingered quietly, their eyes sharp and alert. Men who sensed a palpable change in the atmosphere, but hadn't yet fully grasped its significance. Their presence added an unspoken gravity to the moment, marking it as something far beyond routine. Hale's eyes went to the blast pouch in her hand. "Explain." Roke started to speak, but Leira cut in. "Timer set wrong on the C4. 14 minutes to detonation. It would have been airborne in 5. Hale's gaze lingered on her a moment longer before he took the pouch from her. He weighed it once, then handed it off to one of the officers. "Dispose of it." "Now?" The officer hurried off. The other stayed rooted, still watching Leira. Hale's voice, when it came again, was quieter but carried further. "Do you make a habit of dismantling live explosives in the middle of my yard?" Leira met his eyes evenly. "Only when someone else makes a habit of arming them." There was a flicker, just a flicker, at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, not yet. "You're coming to the command tent," he said finally. "We have a route to reconsider." As they walked, Roke fell into step beside her, his tone low. "Kent's going to love this." Leira didn't reply. The truth was, she didn't care whether Kent loved it or not. The crate had been a message, whether intentional or just careless. And messages had senders. Inside the tent, the map was still spread wide, but now there were new eyes around it. 2 more officers, a comm specialist, and Kent herself, who straightened at the sight of them. Hale didn't waste time. Nox just prevented this base from becoming a crater. "I'm listening to her. All of you will too." The focus of the room shifted toward her, with a dozen pairs of eyes reflecting a mix of doubt, intrigue, and, most notably, a newfound respect that had been absent just an hour earlier. Taking a step closer to the table, she gently placed her fingertips on the map, right over the area known as the Western Gap. "This spot," she began, her voice steady, "is a death trap." Kent started to speak, but a sharp look from Hale stopped her mid-sentence. Leira's finger followed a path upward on the map, landing on the subtle hatch marks she had observed before. "Here's the reason why." Beneath this section lies a network of underground bunkers. It doesn't show up on your latest intelligence because you're relying on satellite data and recent reports. I'm reading the land itself, a quiet settled, the kind that comes before a choice is made. Hale leaned back slightly. Then let's hear your alternative. The command tent felt different now. The stale heat trapped beneath the heavy canvas seemed to thicken, as if even the air knew that something had shifted outside in the yard. Colonel Hale had brought her in not as a witness, not as a technician, but as a voice. And in a place like Fort Holloway, that meant more than it sounded. The map still sprawled across the center table, a topographic quilt of pale greens, tan ridges, and thin blue veins of seasonal rivers. Markers stood like little armies on its surface, red for enemy positions, blue for friendly, yellow for contested zones. Colonel Hale moved around the table with deliberate steps, the kind that made others unconsciously clear space. Roke hovered just inside the entrance flap, eyes darting between faces. Kent stood opposite the colonel, arms crossed, chin lifted, her gaze locked on Leira, as if trying to read a code in her expression. "All right," Hale said finally, his voice carrying in that clipped, precise way of a man who'd spent decades making himself heard over rotor wash and artillery fire. "We've all been working from the same assumption, that the Western Gap is our best access to the objective. Light resistance, minimal surveillance, a clean path in." His eyes flicked to Leira. She disagrees. Leira didn't move from where she stood. She let the weight of the room settle on her for a beat before stepping forward to the table. Her shadow crossed the map, falling over the Western Gap sector. "That route will get you pinned," she said, her tone even, not performative. "It's designed to look open. A gap in their perimeter, sparse patrols, poor terrain for heavy armor. On paper, it's the smart choice. In reality, it's a funnel." Kent's voice cut in, tight with controlled irritation. "With respect, you've been on this base for 3 days. Our reconnaissance team has weeks of data on that corridor. Drones, sat passes, human intel. None of it shows what you're claiming." Leira's eyes met hers briefly, then dropped to the map again. "That's because you're looking at what they want you to see." She reached for one of the smaller, unmarked overlays stacked at the table's edge, a transparent sheet with faint contour lines, faded with age. She laid it over the sector in question, aligning landmarks with practiced precision. Beneath the printed ridges, faint symbols appeared, tiny hatch marks and dots, almost lost in the print. "This is from before the insurgents took the region," she said. "Old survey records, archived deep enough that you'd need to know exactly where to dig to find them. These dots mark vent shafts for an underground munitions bunker system. It's sealed now, but the terrain above it is honeycombed with reinforced chambers and service tunnels, perfect for concealment and perfect for an ambush." Roke stepped closer, his brow furrowing as he traced the pattern. "Those vents line up with the high ground along the gap's edges." Leira nodded. "Which means anyone with half a brain and a few heavy weapons could turn that corridor into a shooting gallery. You'd never make it halfway through." The murmurs around the table grew, officers leaning in, eyes scanning the overlay as if the symbols might rearrange themselves into something less troubling. Kent straightened, her voice sharpening. "Even if that's true, we have no confirmation those tunnels are in use. We can't just rewrite an entire operation based on," she gestured at Leira, "a hunch from someone who hasn't even been cleared for combat deployment." The tent stilled, the words hung there, brittle and barbed. Leira's gaze didn't flinch. She let the silence stretch a heartbeat too long before answering, her tone still level. "It's not a hunch." Her hand rose slow and deliberate to the collar of her plain, insignia-less shirt. She hooked 2 fingers beneath the fabric and pulled it down just enough for the dim light to catch the embroidered patch sewn into the inside seam. Deep crimson thread on black, the stylized sigil unmistakable to those who recognized it. The air in the tent changed. It wasn't just surprise, it was recognition layered with something heavier. For most here, that emblem existed only in rumor, in classified briefings spoken in rooms without recording devices. Colonel Hale's eyes fixed on the patch. His jaw tightened, not in disapproval, but in confirmation of a suspicion he'd carried since the yard. Echo read. Kent's voice faltered. That unit was dissolved years ago. Leira released the collar, the patch disappearing again beneath the neutral fabric. Echo read, isn't a unit you dissolve, it's a directive. You either complete it or you don't come back. The silence that followed was thicker than before, filled with the unspoken weight of what she'd just revealed. Roke's expression shifted from guarded skepticism to something closer to respect and maybe a trace of unease. Hale broke the stillness with a short nod. You're saying we avoid the Western Gap? Where instead? Leira reached for a grease pencil and circled a sector to the north. The terrain there was more rugged. Broken ridges, narrow passes, patches of dense rock outcroppings. Here, the approach is harder. It'll take us out of standard vehicle range, so we go light. Teams of 4, staggered movement, but it bypasses the bunkers completely and positions us above their main guard rotation. Kent leaned over the map, studying the lines she'd drawn. The northern approach has no documented ingress point to the objective. Leira's reply came without hesitation, her tone carrying the weight of certainty. No, it's not on any chart you'll find, she said evenly. But it exists. There's a narrow maintenance shaft cut straight into the cliff wall, concealed beneath rubble from a deliberate rock slide years ago. It's the kind of thing you'd walk past 100 times without noticing, unless you knew the exact shadow to watch for, and only in the last sliver of daylight before the sun drops. Hale's gaze lingered on her, his expression unreadable for a long beat. Then his voice dropped into the kind of decisive tone that didn't invite debate. We'll reconfigure the entire operation around that. And you, his eyes locked onto hers, sharp and unblinking, will deliver that briefing to the unit yourself. Kent drew in a breath, ready to object, but Hale's hand came up like a barrier. Lieutenant, I don't care if she walked into this base with a ladle in her hand instead of a rifle. Today she's kept this mission alive twice. First by preventing an explosion in our own backyard, and now by steering us away from an ambush. That's more than enough to earn her a voice at this table. The statement hit the room like the slam of a judge's gavel. Kent's jaw worked once, lips tightening to a thin line, but no words came. The silence that followed was as telling as any salute. Leira stepped back from the table, not out of deference, but to give them room to digest. She could feel the weight of every stare in the tent, calculating, re-evaluating, revising the box they'd tried to put her in when she'd arrived. For the first time since stepping onto this base, she wasn't invisible. But she knew better than to mistake visibility for safety. The command tent emptied slowly, the tension trailing behind the officers like the heat off the desert floor. Colonel Hale didn't dismiss Leira. He waited until the last body had crossed the threshold before speaking again. You've got the op, he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't barked like an order. It was stated as though the decision had already been carved into stone. Leira didn't nod. She simply stepped forward, placed both palms on the edge of the operations table, and studied the northern sector she'd circled earlier. We'll need to move in 2 hours. Hale's brow lifted slightly. That fast? They're already expecting you at Western Gap. The longer we sit, the more they'll prepare their fallback defenses. The northern path works because it's unmonitored, but that won't last forever. He didn't argue. You'll have full command of Roke's detachment. Roke himself stepped in from the flap, still holding the look of a man trying to reconcile the version of her he'd seen carrying ammo crates with the one now drafting his battle plan. You'll answer to her, Hale told him. Completely. Understood? Roke's jaw flexed. Understood, sir. Leira didn't waste a second. She dragged a fresh topographic overlay onto the table, snapped open a grease pencil, and began marking lines, clean, decisive strokes that avoided unnecessary flourishes. 4 fire teams, she said, her tone clipped but calm, each with a squad leader who knows how to make a call without waiting for permission. We stagger our start by 5 minutes per team. That way, if one is compromised, the others can still move without broadcasting their position. Kent, who had lingered near the entrance, opened her mouth, but Leira didn't give her the chance. We travel light, half loadouts, no heavy armor, claymores and smoke only. No thermals. The tunnels will make them useless once we're inside. She pointed to a jagged ridgeline just north of the objective. This is our rendezvous if extraction is hot. The cliff here blocks line of sight from the south, so they can't target us directly. I'll call in the bird from there. Roke studied the marks on the map. We'll have to carry everything over those ridges. That's a lot of weight for... Not if you cut it in half and redistribute between teams, Leira interrupted. I've already calculated the load. You'll still be under 70 pounds each. He didn't like being cut off, but he said nothing this time. Hale motioned toward the tent flap. You've got 2 hours. Make it happen. Outside, the light was harsh, bouncing off the pale dirt and the aluminum siding of the supply sheds. The air smelled of cordite and fuel, layered over with the faint bite of ozone from the generators humming along the perimeter. Leira strode to the equipment yard, Roke keeping pace beside her. Soldiers turned their heads as they passed, not in the casual, dismissive way from 3 days ago, but with the wary attention given to someone who might be evaluating them. She stopped at the racks of rifles first. Pull the HK-41-6s, she told the armorer. Short barrel configurations only. Suppressed. The armorer glanced at Roke, but Roke only nodded. From there, she moved down the line. Optics, spare magazines, comm units stripped to bare essentials. She vetoed the heavier plate carriers in favor of lighter modular rigs, choosing mobility over maximum coverage. At the comms table, she checked each headset herself, running a fingertip along the mic booms to ensure they weren't cracked or loose. Channel 3 for internal, she told the tech. Channel 1 for command. No chatter unless it's actionable intel or movement calls. If I hear someone talking about the weather, I'll cut their feed. Roke smirked faintly at that. When they reached the munitions lockers, she was already mentally mapping the sequence. 3 smoke canisters per man, 2 white, 1 yellow. White for cover, yellow for signaling extraction. No fragmentation grenades. We're avoiding unnecessary concussive signatures underground. Echo Red Doctrine? Roke asked. Leira didn't look up from the inventory sheet. Echo Red survival rate. 2 hours was generous for what she had in mind. By the 40-minute mark, the gear was staged in neat rows on the tarmac. The fire teams stood by their loads, watching her make one last circuit. She stopped in front of the youngest-looking soldier, a private whose kit looked a fraction too loose on his frame. She adjusted the straps herself, then tightened the chin buckle on his helmet. If you feel wind coming from your left inside the tunnel, you're near a vent shaft. That means you're exposed. Move faster. The private nodded hard, eyes wide. In the corner of the yard, Kent approached Hale quietly. She's running them like they've trained with her for years. Hale's gaze stayed on Leira. By the time they leave this base, they'll believe they have. Briefing was short, but every word counted. She used no slides, no handouts, just the map on the table and her voice. We're not going in to prove how loud we can be, she said. We're going in to extract hostages without alerting half the valley. That means you check your corners before you move, you check your 6 before you breathe, and you follow every movement call as if your life depends on it, because it will. Her eyes scanned the room, pausing just long enough on each man and woman to make them straighten under her gaze.
If we get split, you fall back to the rendezvous point. If you can't make it, you hole up and wait for extraction.
No hero plays. The people we're bringing back don't care if you look good doing it. They care that you come back alive. It wasn't rousing, but it was solid, practical. It left no illusions about what they were walking into. By the time she stepped back into the sun, the first team was already loading their gear into the modified MRAP for the short transport to the northern ridge. The air was heavier now, not from the heat, but from the weight of expectation. As Roke passed her on the way to his vehicle, he gave a short nod, not the lazy half-salute from before, but the kind given between soldiers who understood each other's measure. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Leira felt the base's rhythm match her own. They were moving her way now. The last crate clicked into place on the pallet, straps drawn tight across its surface. Outside, the low rumble of engines signaled that the first MRAPs were idling at the perimeter gate, waiting for the word to move out. The air in the supply hangar was tense but organized, everything flowing in sequence, every movement purposeful. It was the kind of order Leira liked, quiet efficiency, no wasted words. She was double-checking the final manifest when a metallic clatter broke the rhythm. Heads turned. Across the hangar floor, a young private, a replacement fresh from basic, was standing over a fallen grenade canister. It had rolled from an open gear bag, the pin somehow half pulled. The color on the canister was wrong for frag. Leira's eyes narrowed. Grey. Smoke, she muttered. Then, with the sharp hiss of a sudden exhale, the grenade bloomed to life. A thick plume of white erupted from the canister, pouring across the concrete in twisting, hungry fingers. Within seconds, the hangar's clean air dissolved into a choking fog. Visibility dropped to less than a meter. The sound of coughing and scrambling boots filled the space. "Kill the ventilation fans!" Leira's voice cut through the chaos, calm but commanding. The nearest corporal lurched toward the control panel in a half-panic, fingers slapping for the emergency cutoff, but the effort was pointless. The vent was already choked. The release jammed open, and the smoke had taken on a life of its own. It crawled outward in rolling, heavy waves, hugging the ground as if pulled by gravity, finding every dip and crevice in the floor. Within seconds, visibility dropped to a dim, shifting haze, where outlines bled into shadows and shadows into nothing at all. Leira didn't waste breath cursing or questioning. Her instincts flipped into cold, precise command mode. Smoke was never just smoke. It was confusion waiting to turn into chaos. Chaos meant broken formation, lost orientation, and injuries before they'd even stepped onto the battlefield. Her voice cut through the muffled air like a flare. "Squad leaders, on me, now!" Figures took shape in the whiteout, distorted silhouettes sharpening into something human as they closed in on her voice. Roke's broad frame first, then Kent, and two more officers emerging from the haze in staggered steps. They were close enough now to catch the steadiness in her tone, the calm that demanded obedience. "We're moving to the west exit," she ordered, drawing a quick, simple line in the air with her hand. "Single file. Each of you keeps a hand on the shoulder in front. Nobody loses contact. Nobody breaks formation. And nobody runs." Kent's reply drifted in from somewhere just left of Leira's shoulder, her voice taut but disciplined. "And the supply crates?" "They're not breathing," Leira said flatly. "They'll keep. Right now it's people first." She pivoted to Roke, clapping him once on the arm. "You lead. Your build's the easiest for them to track by feel." Without waiting for an answer, she stepped back to the tail of the column, becoming both anchor and guard. One by one she counted the hazy forms ahead of her, mentally matching them to names. Halfway to the exit, a private silhouette wavered. His foot snagged, sending him pitching forward. Leira's hand shot out, gripping the back of his rig in a solid, unyielding hold. She straightened him in one smooth motion, didn't bother with reassurances, just gave a firm push between his shoulder blades to keep him in motion. Momentum was survival now, and every second they kept moving was a second the smoke hadn't claimed. Halfway to the door, someone shouted from deeper inside the haze, "Help! I can't!" The voice was swallowed by a fit of coughing. Leira didn't hesitate. "Roke, take them out. Kent, with me." The pair broke from the line, moving toward the voice. The smoke burned at their eyes, clung to their throats. Leira kept one hand on the wall, navigating by memory of the layout. Her boots found the edge of a workbench, then the open space beyond. The private was crouched low, one hand on his helmet, the other gripping a crate like it was a lifeline. Leira knelt, set a hand on his shoulder. "Leave it," she said simply. He did, and she pulled him to his feet. Kent took his other side, and together they guided him back to the west exit, where the rest of the team was emerging into the hot desert air. Outside, the contrast was almost blinding, the sun's glare bouncing off the sand after the ghost-white murk of the hangar. The soldiers blinked, coughed, spat. No one was bleeding, no one was down. Leira's chest eased a fraction, but the job wasn't done. "Form up in the shade," she told them, pointing to the lee of a nearby supply truck. "Hydrate, eyes on me." Then she turned back toward the hangar. Inside, the smoke still boiled, stubborn and thick. She moved along the wall until she reached the armory's small side door, swung it open, and created a cross breeze. It wasn't much, but combined with the big bay doors now cranked wide, it began to thin the haze. When she emerged again, Colonel Hale was waiting. He didn't speak at first, just studied the hangar, the men, then her. "That could have gone differently," he said finally. "Yes, sir," she replied. "No shouting, no wasted motion. You didn't lose anyone in there." She didn't answer. Hale's gaze sharpened. "That's twice now I've seen you stop a disaster before it started. It wasn't just me," she said, glancing toward Roke and Kent. "Leadership never is," Hale said, "but it starts with someone who doesn't freeze when the air gets thick." By the time the hangar cleared, the men's gear was rechecked, smoke canisters swapped for fresh, and the line of MRAPs was back in readiness. The lost minutes had been made up by disciplined movement. The earlier fluster burned away in the dry wind. As the last latch was secured, Hale stepped in front of the team. "This mission will be dangerous," he said, "but after what I just saw, I know one thing. This team is safe in her hands." Every eye turned to Leira. She didn't give a speech. She simply adjusted the strap on her rig and said, "Mount up." The engines roared to life. The convoy began to roll. They were moving north, her way. The northern face of the canyon didn't look like much from a distance, just another stretch of wind-scraped rock, its jagged slopes shadowed in the fading afternoon light, but Leira knew better. She'd memorized the terrain when it still belonged to a different life, under a different name, wearing a different patch. The convoy rolled to a controlled stop roughly 2 kilometers before the ridge, tires grinding softly over packed sand before settling into stillness. One by one, engines clicked off, their heat dissipating into the open air. Radio chatter was reduced to barely audible murmurs, the kind of whispers meant to disappear into the wind. That same wind threaded through the halted vehicles, carrying with it the faint rasp of grit scraping along metal panels and the dry electric smell of the high desert. Leira dropped to one knee beside Roke, boots sinking slightly into the powdery dust. She unrolled a creased, hand-drawn overlay and anchored it against her leg with a gloved palm so the restless breeze wouldn't steal it. Her fingertip landed on a narrow slash of white ink between two jagged boulders. "We ascend here," she said, her tone steady, deliberate. "The cut is shielded from any direct lines of fire. Drones won't have visual, and there are no mounted guns in range." Roke leaned forward, following her indication, then tilted his gaze toward the rocky rise itself. "From this distance, looks like a cliff face," he muttered. "It's not," she countered, glancing up just long enough to meet his eyes. "More like a ladder the earth never finished carving." The holds are there if you know how to find them. Maintain 3 meters between climbers. If someone loses footing, the fall ends with them, not the person above or below. Kent stepped in quietly, the faint click of her rifle sling the only sound as she eased the weapon into a low, ready carry. Her voice was level but edged with anticipation. What do we find once we're over the crest? Leira traced the map with care, her finger curving toward a shaded, irregular hollow etched into the overlay. Here, she said, an entrance tucked beneath an overhang. The rock face vents heat constantly, and that thermal bleed masks the opening from scans. It's invisible to sensors unless you're standing in front of it. That's where we go in, and that's how we stay ghosts until it's too late for them to react. They moved fast but silent, boots crunching softly on the scree. The climb began as a scramble, then narrowed into a jagged corridor of stone. Here the air grew cooler, shadows stretching long across the uneven walls. Roke led the ascent, his bulk making the handholds look smaller than they were. Leira followed midway in the file, scanning both ahead and behind. Every so often she glanced up, not at the rock, but at the sliver of sky, to check for the glint of optics or rotor shadows. At the ridge crests, the team crouched low. Below them, the hollow yawned, no bigger than a 2-truck lot, its far wall smooth except for a slit of darkness at waist height. "That's the door?" one private whispered. "That's the vent shaft," Leira corrected. Doors to the left recessed. They slid down the far side, hugging the wall. 2 guards stood at the recess, one smoking, the other adjusting a sling. Their rifles were slung loose, safety discipline lax. Leira signaled, 2 fingers, then a fist. Roke and Kent ghosted forward, boots silent. The takedowns were clean, one guard muffled with a chokehold, the other dropped with a silent baton strike to the base of the skull. Both were zip-tied and pulled into shadow. Leira approached the door. The keypad was old tech, 7-digit input, scuffed from sand wear. She reached into her vest and produced a strip of black polymer no larger than a pen. One press against the pad, and the micro-prongs bloomed, reading the circuit in reverse. "Open," she murmured. The lock clicked. Inside, the air shifted, cooler, metallic, tinged with the faint sting of disinfectant. The corridor sloped down in a long curve, lit by low amber strips along the floor. The team split into 2 elements, Roke taking left, Kent right, moving in coordinated sweeps. The deeper they went, the more the hum of machinery bled into the silence, a low, constant vibration underfoot. At the second junction, voices drifted from a side room. Leira halted her element, peeked around. 2 hostiles at a console, both armed. She signaled a breach. The door slid back, and in 3 seconds it was over. 2 bodies down, weapons secured, no alarms. The holding cells were farther in, behind a reinforced bulkhead. This time the breach wasn't clean. The steel groaned open on manual override, revealing a row of narrow rooms, each holding 2 or 3 civilians in dust-streaked clothes. Eyes widened at the sight of the team. Some of the captives shrank back, others surged forward to the bars. "We're getting you out," Leira said. Roke and Kent moved down the line, cutting locks, ushering people into the corridor. The team passed out canteens, quick checking for injuries. A boy, no more than 8 years old, clung to Leira's sleeve as if letting go meant the world would fall apart. His small fingers dug into the fabric, knuckles white, eyes wide with fear and dust. "Are you soldiers?" he asked, his voice a mix of hope and disbelief. "Something like that," Leira replied, steady but brief, urging him forward with a gentle nudge. There was no time to explain. Their planned exit wound back toward the cavern's main entry, but before they reached it, a low vibration began to build in the air above. The vents high overhead rattled, coughing out bursts of grit as the sound grew, a deep mechanical growl that turned into the unmistakable churn of rotor blades cutting through the sky. Kent's headset spat static and half a warning before dying altogether. Reinforcements inbound. The rest was swallowed by the interference. Leira's gaze shifted instantly southward. Her voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the edge in it. "They're coming from the south approach. Open ground's a death sentence. We won't beat them to the flats." From the pack slung at her side, she drew 2 stubby canisters, their metal skins scuffed and dented from old use. She weighed them in her hands once, as if confirming an old friend's presence. Roke caught the look and bared his teeth in something between a grin and a challenge. "Pulling out one of your museum pieces?" "Let's just say it's proven itself before," she answered. Working quickly, they set the canisters near the narrow throat of the hollow, tucking them into the rock shadow where the enemy wouldn't spot them too soon. Each was wired to a small remote detonator clipped to a vest. The boy stayed behind her leg, peering out at the strange metal objects with silent curiosity. The first elongated shadow slid across the upper rim of the ridge, a dark blot against the pale stone, and the low thump of rotorwash swelled to a heavy pulse. Leira didn't wait for them to drop lower. She pressed the trigger in her palm. Both canisters cracked open with a sharp pop, spewing columns of blinding white smoke that surged outward in violent swirls, swallowing the hollow like a sudden blizzard. The cloud rolled upward and outward, curling around the stone walls before spilling into the sky. From above, it looked like a storm blooming from nowhere. The helicopter's approach faltered, banking away in a wide arc. Through the haze, the thudding rotors shifted position, uncertain. On thermal optics, the dense, heat-treated smoke would flare bright, scattering the infrared signatures of every living thing beneath it until they were indistinguishable from the chaos of the heated air. It bought them time, and in an extraction, time was the rarest ammunition they had. Moving in the cover, the team guided the captives back up the chute. The climb was slower with civilians, but no one slipped. At the crest, the MRAPs were waiting, engines hot. The first civilians were loaded, then the rest, each vehicle sealing up tight before rolling. As Leira swung into the last truck, she looked back. The hollow was gone, swallowed by its own camouflage. She keyed her comm. Package secure, 0 casualties, returning to base. Hale's voice came through, clipped but steady. "Copy that. Bring them home." The convoy turned south, the desert swallowing their tracks. 3 days after the operation, Fort Holloway had returned to its steady rhythm, a place where the constant hum of machinery and the distant thud of training rounds were as much a part of the air as the heat itself. In the motor pool, mechanics rolled tool carts over cracked pavement, calling to each other above the hiss of compressors. At the firing range, the staccato bark of rifles kept time with shouted commands. Supply trucks rumbled through the main gate, carrying everything from water drums to crates of spare parts, and the midday sun turned the metal roofs into plates of blinding light. In the middle of it all, Leira Nox was back where she had been before anyone knew her name, in the storage bay of the ammunition depot, wearing the same plain fatigues, her collar high enough to hide the crimson and black insignia stitched to the inside. She moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this job for years, stacking crates by weight, checking each seal, logging each serial number without looking at the keypad. A casual observer would have thought she'd never left, never crossed the ridge, never crawled through a vent shaft with her heart hammering in her ears, never pulled captives out of darkness while rotor blades hunted the ground overhead. She didn't hum or whistle. She worked in silence, the way she had when she first arrived. Roke appeared in the doorway, leaning a shoulder against the frame. He wasn't in armor today, just a plain t-shirt and cargo pants, but the way he stood made it clear he'd never stopped thinking like a soldier. For a long moment, he just watched her move. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Never thought I'd say this, Nox," he said, "but I was wrong about you, all the way wrong." She looked up from the crate she was sliding into place. "That's fine. You weren't supposed to be right." He smirked faintly, but there was something behind his eyes now. Respect, maybe even something close to trust. "Still, you saved all of us. That means something, whether you want it to or not." She didn't answer, just bent to check the latch on the next crate. Kent came in behind him, her expression more guarded, as if she was still weighing the right words. "I owe you an apology," Kent said finally. "I was doing my job, but I misjudged you, badly." Leira straightened, met her gaze. "You were doing your job, so was I." Kent shifted on her feet, then extended a hand. For a second, it looked like Leira might ignore it, but she took it with a brief, firm shake before going back to her work. Colonel Hale's arrival was impossible to miss. The subtle tightening of posture from everyone in the bay, the way conversations trailed off in the corners. He stepped inside without hurry, eyes sweeping the space until they found her. "Nox," he said, and there was a weight in his voice that drew every eye. She looked up, her face unreadable. "Sir, we've set aside quarters in the officers' wing for you," he said. "Private room, better conditions than the depot. You've earned that much." "Appreciate it," she said, "but I'll stay here." Hale's brow furrowed, not in disapproval, but in something closer to curiosity. "Why?" "Because people don't watch the shadows, Colonel. From here, I can move where I need to, do what needs doing. The less they notice me, the more I can get done." He studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Very well, but you know you've got a place, if you ever want it." She said nothing more, and he didn't press. When he left, the room seemed to exhale. Roke and Kent exchanged a glance, but didn't try to change her mind. By late afternoon, the depot had grown quiet again. The last delivery truck pulled out, its tailgate rattling as it crossed the lot, and the sun slid lower toward the horizon. Shadows stretched long between the stacks of crates. Leira stepped outside, pausing in the open yard. The sky to the west was painted in layers of copper and deep rose, the kind of sunset that made even a fortress like Fort Holloway seem like part of something larger. She stood there for a long moment, the light catching the edge of her collar. With one hand she adjusted it higher, hiding the flash of crimson and black beneath. Behind her, the base kept moving, voices calling orders, boots on concrete, the distant whine of a chopper lifting off. She didn't turn to watch any of it. Tomorrow she'd be somewhere else. Maybe another base, another name, another job that looked too small to matter until it didn't. That was the way of Echo Red, unseen until the moment they couldn't be ignored, and gone again before anyone had time to understand what they'd just witnessed. As the last line of sunlight slid off the top of the depot roof, Leira walked back inside, closing the door behind her. The latch clicked softly, swallowed by the hum of the overhead lights, and Fort Holloway returned to its routine. Somewhere beyond the wire, another mission was already waiting. She'd be there when it mattered. Until then, she was invisible. Some stories, they fade the moment the dust settles. This wasn't one of them. At Fort Holloway, the official reports would log the mission as successful extraction. No casualties. Zero loss of equipment. The bullet points were clean, efficient, forgettable. But the truth? The truth lived in the moments the reports would never capture. The heat of a grenade's smoke choking the depot. The silent signal of a hand that knew exactly where the enemy would be before the enemy knew themselves. The look in a colonel's eyes when he realized the quietest person in his base was the reason his men were still breathing. 3 days after the ridge, Leira Nox was back in the depot, moving crates like she had before any of it began. The sun still baked the tin roofs. The dust still hung in the air. To anyone who hadn't been there, she was just another shadow in a place full of them. And that was exactly how she wanted it, because people like her don't live in the spotlight. They don't chase medals or speeches. They don't leave behind statues. They operate in the thin, cold space between disaster and safety, the space where most people never even realize a choice was made that saved their lives. Colonel Hale knew, Roke knew, Kent knew, and every man and woman who followed her through that ridge would carry the memory like a compass they didn't even know they'd needed. That's the thing about Echo Red. You never see them coming. You only realize they were there after the danger has passed, when you're standing in the quiet and you can't explain why you're still alive. Leira never explained the patch. She never had to. As the last light slipped over the walls of Fort Holloway, she tightened her collar, hiding the crimson and black insignia again. Tomorrow, she'd be somewhere else. Different uniform, different job, same mission, and somewhere a commander would wonder why the weakest-looking person in the room was the one they couldn't afford to lose. If you're watching this, you already know the real warriors aren't always the ones they send to the front first. Sometimes they're the ones you almost forget are there until the moment you can't imagine facing what's ahead without them. So let me ask you, where are you watching from? Are you one of the people who sees the quiet ones, or are you still looking past them? Drop a 1 if you're new here, a 2 if you've been riding with us for a while, and a 3 if you've been with veteran biker since the beginning. And if you believe that courage doesn't need a rank, that leadership can be silent but still unshakable, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe. Because these aren't just stories, they're reminders, warnings, and sometimes they're the only record that the truth ever happened. Leira Nox will vanish again. That's her way. But somewhere out there, the next Echo Red is waiting, and when the time comes, they'll step forward without hesitation, without applause, and without needing permission. The mission will end, the patch will disappear, and the world will never know how close it came until the next story. Ride safe, keep your eyes open, and remember, not every legend needs a name. Some just need to be ready. This was Veteran Biker.